ideas they have to increase the housing stock in our community. And so tonight's discussion is going to be about their thoughts. This is not a formal presentation, but whatever comments and ideas we have can be brought back to them for incorporation into their later proposal. So we'll hear from them first. We'll have some, as usual, committee questions. We'll open it up for public if there are any additional questions. And then at the end, a final resolution on what actions we as a committee will want to take. So without much further to say about that, I guess I'll start with Barbara Blair. Is that correct, Barbara?
Yeah. Yeah.
Very good.
So
all right, I'll introduce Barbara and have her introduce her team, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Paul, very much, and Jean-Daniel for having us here this evening. I'm here with Frank Fish and Sylvia Delfava, who are from BFJ Planning, and we hired them, we commissioned them probably, I don't know, was it 6 months ago, to do a study on the possibility of adding housing stock to the neighborhood. The reason we were interested in this was because COVID had a detrimental impact on the whole wide world, but it certainly had an outsized impact on the garment district in Midtown Manhattan. A lot of people that left the neighborhood when they came back, the social disorder in the streets was really just devastating. People were refusing to come into their offices. They're ending their leases. We became really concerned that with all the building that's going on in the city, if brand new Class A office building, people would trade up less space, but more expensive buildings. And the question became, what's the future for our building stock? The neighborhood, as all of you know, because you live here, is it has the highest crime rates in the city. It has, especially around drug arrests, drug dealing, that kind of thing. It is very, very slow to return, even slower than the rest of the central business district. It has fewer residents per acre than any other neighborhood in the 5 boroughs of New York City. And we're looking for a way to create a 24/7 neighborhood to animate the street life and the public realm spaces that we have, and to find new stakeholders for this neighborhood so that we can assure its vitality and really survival. So with that, Frank, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then there's lots of things that we can discuss. I should mention that we're moving forward on 3 tracks simultaneously, and how successful we'll be or unsuccessful, we'll see. Brian Weber is intimately involved in one of these, which is the social disorder and crime in the neighborhood. And we advocate very strongly with our elected officials to do something about those conditions. We have also applied for funding from the Downtown Revitalization Initiative, that's state funding to do capital improvements in the neighborhood. We have public plazas and bike lanes and those sorts of things that were put in as temporary 15 years ago, and they've never been made permanent. So the neighborhood is kind of a sacrifice zone for the city and state of New York. It always has been. The city and state has never invested in this neighborhood. Only the fashion industry ever did, and they're a shrinking percentage of the workforce that's here. Frank will talk about that. So we're really coming to you as part of this community to say, what's our future? Like, who's going to live, work, and visit here? And how do we ensure that this neighborhood has a vibrant, robust future?
Great. Would you like me to pick up there, Barbara? Or?
I sure would, yeah.
Okay, great. I'm Frank Fish, and I'm hoping that Sylvia Delfava can share her screen, if that's possible.
I can probably do that.
Let
me try.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Sylvia. And this garment district study, which we're commissioned to do by Barbara's group, really also I want to credit here our affiliate Urbanomics, who did our market analysis, and also the architectural analysis was by Perkins Eastman. But the study's kind of in 4 parts, and the report overview here, I just giving, you can see at the bottom, BFJ Planning, and then Urbanomics and Perkins Eastman, and our client, the Garment District. But the next slide just shows you chapter 1. It was sort of about, well, why this report? Barbara's covered this pretty well, but we wanted to document, what are the facts and some salient facts and figures. And so we just wanted to start here. I know that you all are familiar with the Garment District boundary, but we thought it was worth showing, and it's quite large from just to the west of Fifth Avenue there on the right-hand side of this slide, all the way over to Ninth Avenue. And, basically between about 35th Street, 36th Street, up to around 40th. So it's a significant area, the Garment District. And what we did is we tried to get the best data we could. And the next slide sort of shows just in chapter 1 in this report. Some of this I want to credit city planning for, and then others, the Department of Labor, and then the city itself in terms of square footage. But you can see here that apparel manufacturing, both in New York City, has declined drastically from 1987 through 2016. And the Garment Center, we tried to get as much recent data as we could. City planning had garment jobs in 1987 at 30,000. Department of Labor now has them at about 3,000. And so it's a tenth of what it was. It's greatly shrunk. And I think seeing the figures and the charts, it helps understand it helps one to understand some of the issues here. Barbara already mentioned the land use mix. We were very surprised it was this low. The gray there, garment manufacturing at 1.8%. If the city's data, we believe the city's data is correct. We've kind of referred to it, as Barbara did, as 2%, just rounding it off. But the others are, as you can see there, a residential component and an office. The major component of land use is office in the area. So garment manufacturing jobs now, it's called the Garment District, but those jobs represent about 1.8% of the total jobs. So that's the sort of, in a way, why of this report, that lack of those jobs has had a real impact on the district. And then we took a look at, and Tina Lund led this from Urbanomics in chapter 2, which is the next slide. What is the office market like? And I'm not saying anything here that you already don't know, quite frankly, from just the press in New York City, and the mayor's office. But the office space, the office market is slow. To be kind about that, there's a fairly significant vacancy rate in the Garment District. We're not sure it's current. It's somewhere between, we think, 17% and as high as 21%. The figures we've seen vary a little bit. We didn't want to overstate this, but the projection for office space is that it's a very slow recovery. So there is a certain market, part of the segment of the market in Class A space over at Hudson Yards. Even that has some significant vacancies, but where some tenants are looking because it's very modern space and they're willing to pay more for less space. But the implications for the Garment District for Class B and C is probably Urbanomics feels higher vacancies and lower rents. On the chart here, you can see some of the rent area, some of the rent levels by where they're located. But basically, they're in a range of, the low 40s, in some cases, even the high $30 range, up to maybe $50 a square foot. So they're relatively, not saying there's not a market here, the office market, but it's a relatively weak market right now. And then we looked beyond the office market at, well, what are the other markets? And first, I might cover the retail market, which I'm sure you also know as a result of the Amazon effect, and then COVID-19, and then the office workers not coming back to the offices in full force. Retail remains very weak also. But the one element that doesn't is housing demand. Housing demand in Manhattan throughout the city exceeds supply. So the implications for the garment district is if you could do housing, more residential has a strong market. And then if you had residential, you would be able to put people on the street. You'd be able to have more of a 24-hour sort of life, live, work area. And that would add greatly, we think, to the quality of life on the street. So, but the next question was, well, how much residential? And how could it be done? And we've taken a couple of approaches here, but we looked at the whole garment district, but we also looked at the special garment center district overlay, which is there in blue, all outlined in blue. And I think you all know this pretty well. The underlying zoning is M16 and the C6-4M that you can see, but that special garment overlay district provides a zoning overlay which can be modified or amended by a text change alone. And then over on the right-hand side of this slide, there's an area between 5th and 6th Avenue, which is an M16. And that, we think, it would, if that were changed by city planning and the council, you would need a map change probably for that. The beauty of the special garment center district is this is the only place it's mapped. And if we were to make some text changes there, they would not reverberate throughout the city. So we think it's an easier, perhaps quicker thing to do in the area. But the next slide shows, if we look at this whole area and we compare it, by the way, we looked at the financial district as a comparable, and we also looked at Chelsea. And someone's recently mentioned to us, hey, we should look at where our offices are in the Flatiron district. There's no perfect comparable, I think, to the garment district. But if you use these two, which the financial district, they did allow conversions to residential. Chelsea, the same thing. And over a 10-year period, generally, when they allowed this, about 10, you can see the financial district, about 10% of the floor space was converted. And in Chelsea, it was about 12%. So if you applied that to the existing square footage area in the garment district, which is significant, and then use the factor for unit sizes, you're going to get somewhere between 2,600 and maybe 3,200 units at that rate of conversion between the financial district and Chelsea. We've sort of said, for just to use a number, a round number, it has a potential of maybe 3,000 units over the next 10 years. Now, a 25-year projection, which we did below, is of course much greater, but it's also less, projecting out that far is a little bit harder to do. But you can see the numbers there, 5,000 to 6,700 or so. So it's significant. And with those numbers of units, you're going to get at least, on average anyway, probably 2 people, maybe 1.9 to 2.1 people per unit. So you're going to increase the population of the area. So we think there is a fairly good potential, but it's also not, as some board members in the garment district said to us, it's also not overwhelming. In other words, this is not a huge number when you look at the total square footage of 40 million square feet in the garment district area. So it's a number, though, that we think will make an effect and have an impact. So that was the potential. And then we wanted to bring this to city planning with some recommendations. And I think the first one we would suggest at least looking at is the special garment center district text change. Just a text change that would allow residential. Now, as you know, and particularly I think board members know, that they did something in 2018 that did allow some residential on the west side of the district for buildings under 70,000. And quite frankly, in the C6-4M, it just didn't work. There were very, very few, if any, conversions. And the building allowance just wasn't great enough, according to our architects, for a financial pro forma to work out. well for most buildings. So what we've suggested is don't be so timid, if you will. Allow residential as a primary use in buildings. Most of that would be, and you could limit it if necessary to conversions, but the potential is in existing buildings, which could be converted because those buildings, many of them, I think as a lot of you know, are overbuilt in the sense of the FAR and what a developer could do. If they would convert an existing building, they get more floor space than they would by building new in today's zoning code. So it might be by doing just a text change in the garment district overlay, you could have an impact that's, by short term, I mean perhaps 2 to 3 years. In the city, getting through, as you all know better than I, getting through seeker, the seeker process, the city environmental quality review process, and then ULURP, which is a mandated process, that takes some time. If seeker could be done with an EAS and a negative declaration just for the text change, which is fewer units, fewer impacts, then it could go into ULURP and you could get something done in a reasonable period. I mean, 1 or 2 years. The zoning map change we realize is going to take longer at the M16, probably would require an EIS. And now you're talking a longer period of time. You've got to add maybe a year and a half. So those are 2 recommendations we had for city planning. We also thought the text change in the garment district was relatively, nothing's easy. I don't want to say it's easy, but relatively easy at city council because there are no other garment district overlays in the entire city. So this is it. This is the only one. And these are the only places it would affect. Board 4 and 5 are involved, the 2 council members. So it's a limited impact, straightforward way. Now, having said that, I don't want to presume that you'll have lots of questions, for instance, well, if residential is allowed, what are the permutations of it? There's affordable housing questions. There's all kinds of issues, but those issues can be worked with I think, many of the responses city planning has already made. For instance, they've looked at in so-called MX districts, they've looked at residential in manufacturing areas where areas have some manufacturing, with areas that have far more manufacturing now than the garment district has left. So I think this is a very possible short-term sort of amendment that could be made. Now, tax incentives are just, they're really up to the state. I think the state legislature, as you know, the state did not renew some of the tax incentive programs. So that's a policy call, and we don't have sort of direct control over that. It's more the legislature and governor. But what city planning did mention is something that Barbara mentioned, that the garment district is also trying to sort of support and get city agencies to, particularly DOT, to make public realm improvements, that last dot point. And city planning recommended that to us. They said, look, you should include that in any presentations you make, because it's not only the idea of adding people so that you get street life, but it's also then improving those streets as people walk on those streets. And the combination of that should improve the whole quality of life in the area. And it should provide more dollars for retail businesses. And we think that the residential will also make the area more attractive, and therefore offices and office workers would also office and residential are 2 uses that can be, very good side by side. So those were the sort of overall recommendations in the report. And on the one hand, this is a very sort of straightforward, simple message. On the other hand, behind that simplicity, there are details that have to be worked out. And I'm a believer that they could be all worked out. And that's where I think, we'd listen to all your questions on that. And Barbara, unless I turn it
Well,
back to you.
the only thing that I would add is this all came up pre-COVID. Actually, job growth in the district was excellent. I mean, we had an incredible job growth. There were improvements that were in place. They were temporary, and we have been agitating for years that they be made permanent. We've always had social public realm issues, quality of life issues, but during the pandemic, it got just exponentially worse. And we have people now that will not come to work. They will not renew leases. We had a huge tenant in one of our buildings on 8th Avenue that moved to Grand Central. So we're coming to you, and we went to CB5, really as stakeholders in the neighborhood to say, what are our options? Like, what's the future? We know with the hybrid work model, it's not going to be that everyone is working 5 days a week. And if they're going to get better spaces, but just less of it, then what happens to our A buildings become B buildings, and our B and C buildings become what? I don't know. And I do know over the years, many small businesses, most of the businesses in the garment district are 20 people or under. And I've been asked before, can we live work? And the answer, of course, is no. So what we're really trying to find, and with our stakeholders, what's the future for making sure this is a safe, appealing place? We've got all the transportation in the entire region, but an appealing place to locate.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to open up for questions from the committee. I have a series of questions, but I'd rather hear from committee members before I speak. So I see Dale's hand. Joe, I expect you'll have some questions too. So Dale, why don't you get us started, then Leslie, then Joe. Dale?
Thanks, Paul. Thank you for the presentation. I have a few questions. Going back to you don't have to pull it up, but going back to the first slide, there was an other category in the disposition of spaces. Is that principally hotels, or where does hotels?
We've got Port Authority, we've got churches, we've got the parole board, we've got a lot of spaces that are public spaces.
Okay. But the hotels would be in that yellow?
The hotels, I don't know if we have a hotel map, Frank, but what I will say is during the 2005 rezoning of the Hudson Yards, as you recall, if it was 70,000 square feet or under, you could, as of right, convert to hotel or residential. And as Frank said, nobody converted to residential because if you're 70,000 square feet or under, it didn't make economic sense. So we have 53 hotels in the garment district now that have been built since 2005. And frankly, I mean, I wish they were residential because they're also transient stakeholders.
I guess my question is, where are they in that pie?
I think
it's in the 26.8.
Yeah, they're in the yellow. They are in the yellow, Dale.
Okay.
Yeah. The hotels are in yellow.
Do you have a ballpark concept of how big a piece of the yellow it is? Is it 20%? Is it of the total, or is it?
I don't, without the figures in front of me. I know it's significant. It's going to be at least 10% of that number because there's quite a few hotels in the area. But we'd have to get it for you.
And then is the goal of this to refit Class B and Class C office spaces as residential building, entirely residential buildings or mixed use residentials, or to facilitate their demolition and rebuild on the sites?
What I would say is, the city has a problem, which is not enough housing. We have a problem, which is not enough tenants. So we are presenting this to the city as an opportunity right in Midtown with good transportation. They would be conversions. We can't imagine, as Frank said, that you have excess FAR in these buildings. Why would you rip them down? There are very, very few sites. Sylvia did a map of the soft sites in the neighborhood where you could potentially have development, but they're not big sites. So we're really viewing this of a conversion, and it would be live work, and it would be mixed use. I don't have a crystal ball, but I don't imagine these buildings going 100% residential. I mean, it's a business district. It always has been.
So the intent is mixed use, live work, or some combo. Okay.
And our architects, Dale, feel the same way. They feel that obviously some of the bottom floors of the buildings are large. They don't have a lot of light and air. They're harder to convert to residential. They might be better off being kept for commercial. But the tops of the wedding cake buildings are pretty spectacular for work.
Sure, and that's more desirable as residential space.
Yeah.
They'll have a little better views and better light.
Yeah.
And do you have you pinpointed specific buildings that are in our district as potential candidates?
I'll let Barbara, because Barbara's people may have done that. We have not done it in any systematic way. That is, our architect went through, he gave a presentation to the board of the type of building that is the easiest to convert. And, you know,
Right.
depending on where the elevators are, for instance, are there 2 sets of elevators and how big the floor plate is. So
Well,
there's ways to do the conversions.
We also looked at the buildings, how many buildings have excess FAR, so they might be more appealing for conversions. But what I would say is we don't have a whole plan and all the information. We did an initial plan, and the idea was, we think it's a good idea for the neighborhood. I mean, we're a neighborhood improvement organization. We're not EDC. But we think it's a good opportunity for the neighborhood. And if New York City Planning indicated that they had an interest and were willing to pursue this, we would invest more in the kinds of data that they need or that you need. But we did our first study with Frank and Sylvia. We're not going to keep investing if this is a non-starter. So we think we read the same press you read, and we've met with Dan Grodnick twice, and he seems to have an appetite for it because the whole city right now is aggressively pursuing that. I'm sure everyone saw the new New York plan this morning, but we're looking for solutions for the neighborhood.
Right. I would also say that, I can envision a rezoning and a conversion strategy that increases makes flexibility towards live work environments, and also just increases housing stock in our part of the district as being a benefit overall, like a net gain. I would just want to make sure that, and I'm sure your architecture team is on this, that the buildings, when they're converted and refitted, that they provide for all the functions that a residential or partly residential building require, so that they're not, like, we see a lot of this is like my pet peeve with the garment district hotel stock, which is a lot of those buildings, and you know which developer I'm referring to, are built with no function space whatsoever, and it's all offloaded onto the sidewalk. You have guests line. That's not the kind of activation of the streets that we're looking for. You have laundry service offloaded. You have garbage dumped. You have guests lined up, queued up. You have baggage service effectively. So I would want to make sure that the conversions to mixed use or residential account for everything that we're going to want to account for a building with residential units, and it's not offloaded into the streets, especially from a transportation, because I'm the co-chair of the Transportation Planning Committee, and I want to see sidewalk widths that are accommodate pedestrian traffic and the commercial traffic as well, and also like up to the latest standards that we're pursuing in the district in terms of management of piles of garbage and what have you. So I would just keep that stuff. I know it's like this is preliminary and it's about a zoning change, but just keep that in mind.
It's a good point. That is a really good point, because that's part of the
scope. That's part of the scope of the conversion process.
Yes. And it's something that city planning can put in the text, but it's also something the building department ought to be able to control, in those conversions.
Thank you, Dale. Appreciate it. Good comments. Leslie, and then
Thank
Joe.
you. Thank you so much for the presentation. It certainly is an area in need of revitalization. I was wondering what thoughts you may have had regarding organizations like Unite Now, which represents some of the workers in the industry, in using them as a source of future tenants for some of these establishments. Also, maybe some of the healthcare service workers that really live in the outer boroughs that could come and live in Manhattan and service the hospitals, the institutions. And these would be professional people who have incomes that would support and generate industry in the neighborhood.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, 32, no, the healthcare workers, 11, what is it?
32 BJ, 1199.
Yeah, they're in the neighborhood, but yeah,
And also Unite Now, which is part of the garment district, right?
Unite
Workers?
Now, I'm not sure they're still here. They actually
Really?
own the building. They
Okay.
own the building, which they sold on 40th
Okay.
Street between 7th and 8th Avenue.
Okay.
And so they actually had a building, but never mind. We're not going to get into that. That's old news. But that's an excellent idea. I mean, we would go to DCP and say, what's the mix, or how does this look, or those kinds of things. I don't think it's the role of the bid to say, okay, and these are all the things. I really do think it's a community initiative, and that DCP ought to take it up because it's an opportunity.
Thank you, Leslie. Joe, and after Joe will be Brian.
Hello, Barbara, of course, and Frank.
Hi, Joe.
People should know that Frank Fish and his firm worked for the Clinton Special Zoning District like 25 years ago and doing a study for us
Back, yeah.
to reinforce the district. So it's nice to see you back another way.
Yeah.
I'm going to note that to get public support clear around this in full, you need to do the following: a map that has buildings that are overbuilt, because that tells us right away those would not be demolished. That helps a lot about the fear of demolition in the district to have development happen. Second, a map of the soft sites, which you mentioned. Those are probably much less, Barbara, I think. There's very few soft sites compared to the overbuilt. And then just a map of the hotels, because it tells the public, here's what's there. And those are, and you know where they are. So that's just, the coloring on the map. Not too much extra work, but it will help sort of inform the public discussion.
Joe, can I pause you for a second? Can you describe soft sites for the others, please? What
Yes.
is a soft site?
So soft sites are 1 or 2 story or maybe 4-story buildings wedged between 21 or 22-story buildings that certainly could be demolished and redeveloped, or little like a corner, like a 3-story.
Like where the White Castle is on 8th
Right,
Avenue.
like the White Castle, perfect.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
We
Joe,
have
did-
all three.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, Barbara, well, the garment district thought of that, and 2 maps that Barbara asked us to do, and we have those, are the overbuilt, the buildings that are overbuilt, and it's a astounding map to see how many buildings are overbuilt. But the other one that's kind of astounding on the opposite is the soft sites map, which there's aren't,
Very few.
we need to find a soft site just the way you just did.
Yeah.
And there are very few, actually. There's relatively few of them. The third map you asked about, I think Barbara has.
We have it.
Yeah, we did not do the hotel map, but Barbara has it.
We have it, and we can send it to you
Yeah.
tomorrow. And the trouble with those soft sites is they're the ones that have the White Castle and the 7-Eleven and some
McDonald's.
speaking, who was it, Dale? And who was it, Dale? Yes, we have pizza places with no interior space. So all the garbage, everything is out on the sidewalk. And so anyway, those are in buildings that are 2 or 3 stories high.
And so the reason I raised specifically, this helped us a lot in Hudson Yards when we had rezonings along West 34th Street. And Frank found that the buildings that were being rezoned were so overbuilt, there was no danger of their being demolished because they were so heavily overbuilt. And that helped get the discussion focused. So it wasn't as if we're doing a rezoning that's going to erase the neighborhood. I would ask you, Frank and Barbara, to look at the community board's position back from 2018 when the garment district was rezoned, specifically on conversion and the question of inclusionary housing. Because that's going to be another huge issue coming to the community boards. Where is the affordable housing possible? So we actually proposed, and that version of the City Planning Commission had no interest whatsoever, saying to permit a conversion, you must do X number of square feet of inclusionary housing. In other words, to bring the inclusionary housing discussion into conversion. And I believe, especially when you have larger buildings, that's very possible because those economics work. We asked to go larger than 70,000 square feet at that point with the inclusionary housing included, and we were turned down flat by the city of New York. I really believe this is a time to pick up this discussion again. We're a pandemic and, almost 5 years away from this. And I think by getting us, the community, this information, we start to have this public discussion to understand why this is possible. When we did Hudson Yards rezoning, which included Area A of the Garment Center, we fully expected to have major residential use. Instead, we got 6,000 hotel rooms. And those 6,000 hotel rooms, as Brian Weber will tell you, created a little bit of problems in the last couple of years, but it also meant a more transient community as opposed to an established community that ties into our whole 9th Avenue zone.
Right.
So I think this is the right moment to talk about this, to say, how could this be? And it also include if you convert a hotel to housing, there should be an affordable component there. Because I believe there will be hotel conversions, because a lot of those hotels, the sort of budget rate ones, are not going to survive long term too.
Yeah,
So really, this is a great start. I want to figure out how we can get more information to help move it along.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Brian?
Thank you. And thank you, Barbara. I'm present and non-eligible in this conversation or in the vote, but I'm a member of the Garment District Alliance. And I think I am the only individual on this call this evening that actually lives in the Garment District. And I want to tell everyone that it's a wonderful area. You should all move here and we need more housing here. On the surface, I'm very much in favor of this plan. I would like to have more new neighbors. I think to what Barbara speaks, it lends itself to becoming more of a 24/7 neighborhood. And I think that would engage ground floor retail in a different manner. Right now, a lot of the ground floor retail on the side streets are businesses that are open exclusively during the day. And it keeps the pedestrian aspect, inanimate at night. So we would definitely appreciate that. I don't entirely agree with Joe. I don't think a lot of the hotels in this area, we're talking about the newer budget built hotels, will convert. They are remarkably at or close to occupancy, full occupancy, and their ADR rates are higher than they've ever been. So they're doing kind of well. But what I am curious about is I looked at the bigger presentation, Frank, and you had soft sites divided into two categories. So I wanted to ask you about that. And also, to Joe's point, the map that shows what is overbuilt, which are buildings that would lend itself towards redevelopment and reuse, far outweighs the soft sites. I'm wondering though, is there any way that, and this is all preliminary in the conversation, what we can do to see those buildings convert and be reused rather than developers just come in and demolish the soft sites and put up slender buildings in their place. Because really what the goal is to stimulate and transform these fantastic former manufacturing loft buildings into perhaps live work spaces on the lower levels and apartments on the upper levels. What I would hate to see happen is everyone goes after the easy bait. And, while we do have the White Castle building, we also have buildings that I could think of on the cross streets that are underbuilt, but are still commercial buildings of, 4 or 5 stories. The pizzeria we talk about is in a magnificent Emery Roth building. And that's only 3 stories. And that's a building I'd hate to see be what is demolished first and we just get a new building in there. So Frank, I guess the question is for you is, can you explain the 2 maps of the soft site and how you distinguish between, forget if it was like super soft and less soft or something, and then B, how we can, if we do this conversion from office manufacturing use to residential, see that it stimulates conversion of the overbuilt buildings and not just go after the soft sites.
Yeah, I think that latter question, and I'm going to defer to Sylvia on this because she probably can draw up a map on her computer of the soft sites, the differences to it. But I think in your greater question of the conversions, I think if city planning would make the resident a conversion as of right, or at least by just authority of the chair, so that it's not a special permit, that the conversion is as of right. And the development community, I think, will respond better to that because they know their chances of getting an approval in a timely manner is pretty good, and they'll focus on that. Now, if city planning wanted to, it could also restrict the residential component to conversions only. I'm not sure you need to go that far, but if they would make it a principal permitted use, not a special permit, I think development community would respond on conversions because they're going to get more FAR out of them. And I think they would respond better. But I think if it turned out, and I may be wrong on this, that, the developers started, tearing down, developing the soft sites, completely new buildings, and you were worried about that, the zoning could always be modified. But I think that they would respond very well to conversions.
So is the language of conversion preclude demolition? Is that maybe help clarify that?
Yeah, and I think
that.
the councilman mentioned to us too that given the sort of thoughts or ideas of some of his fellow council members, that where you could focus on conversions and give a real incentive for residential in buildings to be converted, most of those buildings don't have residences, people living in them. I'm not saying all of them, there are people living in the buildings, but the major tenants who are there are still offices, and you have high vacancy rates. So what he was saying to us was that you're not displacing, there's not a big displacement argument. It's very nice that the conversions you have, in a way, the vacancy rates are high. Basically, what you have is some bottom floor retail or still garment manufacturing to some extent, but what you have in the building is some offices and a lot of vacancies. So the residential conversion works very well with that, and you can have a mixed use building.
Yeah, I think my question was more about what do we do to limit demolition? I understand the buildings that are overbuilt would lend themselves to conversion, but if we look at, and I can't think of an address off the top of my head, but there are buildings that are, and they're smaller and they're fewer and far between, but they are part of the fabric of the neighborhood, or they allow light onto streets. It would be great to see actual conversions of or reuse of existing buildings rather than, an equivalent of the developer who built the hotels come in and
Hotels, yeah.
and target, these smaller sites, demolish them and then build to max FAR, because there are some buildings that are underbuilt in the area.
There are some, but I don't know, Sylvia, if you can
Yeah, and I think
share
everyone
your
wants
screen
to
on the
see it.
overbuilt buildings. It's quite,
No, I'm very aware of
Oh,
what's
okay, you're-
overbuilt and
all right,
underbuilt.
right.
So
Yeah, I was
Yes,
amazed.
but no one else has seen it.
right.
Yeah,
That's
all
why.
this, all this in red is FAR 12 and more. So you're not, the state multiple dwelling law, as you all know, limits the residential building to 12 FAR. And look at this spread here in the garment district area. All of this in red is above FAR 12. So I think there is a significant incentive for a developer to utilize the FAR, because if they convert the building, they can utilize it. If they tear the building down, they can't utilize it.
Okay, so
So-
selfishly, I'm looking at my street, and I don't think that map is entirely accurate because it shows a
Not.
number of buildings
not.
as less than FAR. Yeah, FAR is greater in most of those buildings. But I guess what I'm getting at is, how do we reuse the existing stock we have without demolishing the soft sites? And that's where we only see the development. That's what I'm asking.
Yeah,
That's a great point.
yeah.
Right. Thanks.
And also, Sylvia, can you share the soft sites map? I mean, this is our idea of the soft sites. I'm not, by the way, this is not a science. So, this was based on a survey that Sylvia did, walking the blocks, and then us checking ownerships, that type of thing. So, and, we sort of broke it up into prime soft sites where we thought, you look at the buildings, they're what Joe, you described earlier, 1 or 2 stories. And then we got into, well, wait, there's some 3, 4 stories, they looked in bad shape. So you make a determination there. But there are not in the garment district overlay a lot of soft sites. Like, we included the post office but as a secondary soft site, I didn't want to include it at first, but then thinking about it, I don't know the future of whether it would stay or not stay. So whereas we did not include one of the churches because, we didn't consider that a soft site, but so there aren't many soft sites in the area. There's more over between 5th and 6th, which I was a little surprised at, but there's more over there.
There are a couple of vacancies, I think, here and here. So that made me think that could be more of a prime soft sites, but not much.
I think we're missing a few of the soft.
Brian, are you?
Yeah.
You good now?
By the way, we may be, as we
Yeah.
said, this is based on a walking,
And I guess my question about this map is, how did you distinguish between what a prime soft site is and a secondary soft site is? I understand the post office, but the other ones.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, our methodology was if the FAR was between 2 and 3, and some sites were also partially vacant, that would be definitely a prime soft site. And if you go higher, so, more than 3 stories or 3 stories, but well maintained, and, with some investment that has been done recently, then it could be more of a secondary soft site. So it's like 3 to 5, I would say. That was the range in stories and FAR. And as you know, they're almost all like 100% coverage. So when you look at the stories, it's also easy to get the FAR. But and obviously this was the base map. It comes from city planning. So we all have the FAR coming from Pluto data.
Right. So I think what would be helpful with this map of soft sites is not to just to base it on FAR rather than vacancy. I think that way we'd have a better sense of building stock that are under the FAR and building stock that over it might just simplify that. But thank you. That was a good explanation how you determine that.
Thank you, Brian. Joe, did you raise your hand again? You want more to say?
Yeah. A few things. First is you need to make some quick corrections to your maps, and I know Barbara's sensitive to this. You have soft sites that are residential buildings in Area A that are protected from demolition, so they are not soft sites
okay.
whatsoever. They need to be noted as residential buildings that are protected. That's a different color. Come up with it, because that'll make people crazy. I'm going to just note for you that on the soft sites, I think we already have height and setback regulations in Area A. And one of the ways to manage this, we had an issue with Hudson Yards Special District. It's the width of a site that you might want to recommend some recommendations. So you don't get, so we avoid what Brian talks about. Somebody buys a 25 by 100 foot lot and thinks they can go, like 300 feet tall or something and build some weird building. We managed that in the special zoning district in Hudson Yards. It's about frontage. So it had to be a certain specific thing. Like Frank, it was a kind of a fine-tuned thing to avoid that.
Right.
You mentioned that the idea for conversion is chair authorization. I think you should note, should be chair authorization subject to inclusionary housing, because they're going to get this kickback anyway. So put it up front as a discussion. And then in our community board in general, we always talk about a range of incomes. So it's not just the market rate and the lowest income, but a range, low, moderate, middle. And we're very hot on that in our affordable housing plan. And it's a huge issue for us. The last piece is for the mixed use buildings. I think it might be helpful both for city planning and for the community to understand that there's these lower floors with very large floor plates. that don't lend themselves to easy conversion, Barbara, right? Because there's too much building on a floor. And that might be a good selling point to note that we're talking about if it's above a floor plate, because some of these floor plates are almost a full lot. They could be like 95 feet or something, right? That maybe you work through this, that the authorization is subject to, if it's a floor plate of X, that's not conversion, it's less than something. It helps you get the idea that you're trying to make something happen as opposed to a wholesale change, and therefore change is managed over time. Because I think a lot of the buildings successful, like the one on 36th Street, Brian, by you, is a it's on the north side that has the
315.
Yeah, 315 West 36. They came through a variance many years ago. They converted almost all the upper floors, but the first like 5 or 6 are commercial. And that might be a model that helps get this through, as opposed to like a corner building, which you have the whole thing residential, because it'll work.
Right. Yeah, no, our architect said something very similar. That is, those lower floors, they might be kept as office floors, ground floor as, retail and or service. And then above that, where you get more light and air and you start to get that wedding cake setback. I mean, they're clearly good residential floor plates.
It would also answer the sector of the community who will say you're getting rid of all the office space or garment center use, because you are protecting certain floors for ongoing commercial use.
That's a very good point, because I don't think, I may have failed to make that clear, that I think the objective here is not to get rid of garment manufacturing or offices. It's to add a use for which there's a very strong market that could complement those uses, and actually not only complement, really enhance them, because residential at the top of some of these buildings would add customers to the retail in the building. They'd have more life for the office workers in the building. And city planning responded. We did meet with them. They're very used to mixed use buildings now at city planning. That is one thing I think that has changed at city planning a little bit. They've gotten very used to of that type of typology in the building.
Great. Brian, before I let you talk again, I'm going to use my privilege because I haven't spoken yet on any of this. And so I'd like to, Barbara and Frank and Sylvia, thanks very much for this. I think you can sense that there is a great deal of support for revitalization of the neighborhood, for finding a way to put some housing in there, but some of the nuances need to be ironed out. I think that this discussion really is, favorable towards your idea, but making sure that we incorporate a lot of things that we discuss regularly as a community board. But before I talk about kind of summarizing those points, one of the things that I found lacking in the presentation is an analysis of the residential vacancy in the area. You talk a lot about how nobody wants to come here to work, and we know that on streets that were largely residential, those also vacated during the pandemic. And we have residential buildings. I don't know what those vacancy rates are like. And if the vacancy rate in the residential buildings is at 17%, 21% to match the core commercial space, that's going to be a less compelling argument to build more residential. So I think you need to incorporate the vacancy rate for the residential in your presentation, so it's a stronger argument for residential does work here. We know it works across the city. We know this is a challenging neighborhood for anybody. So why would anybody want to live here if they don't want to work here, is sort of the question I think that's left unanswered in your presentation. So I'd appreciate some analysis of the residential vacancy to strengthen your arguments. You also talk about tax incentives as an opportunity you might pursue to get people to come in. I find that a lot of times the tax incentives are offered to the landlords and not to the tenants. So maybe some following suit with that notion that nobody would want to live here if they don't want to work here. What incentives will you offer to people to move here? Why would people want to live here? What incentives can you provide them? Joe, you can probably tell me more about the loft law, of how that impacted the lofts down in Soho. And now that is such a tremendously desirable neighborhood. People claim to be artists just so they can get into these lofts still. Maybe there's a way that we can put some language into the garment district, special district area, to incentivize people to come into the area as strictly residential. So I'd like to see some incorporation of those 2 points. We talked a little bit about what buildings can be converted. I think your soft site discussion, the commercial space, the ability, like I love the idea of wedding cake towers, the top tiers being residential, the lower tiers wouldn't necessarily fit. It might be helpful to know, of the 40 million square feet in the garment district, what's actually convertible to residential. If there's a way that we can look at that number too, it'd probably be helpful. So to summarize from what I'm hearing tonight, though, is there's generally support for this sort of movement. And I think, Barbara, you started by saying, you want to know if there's support before going forward with more research. Generally, it seems there is support for this. So I'd say do more research and let's build that. Strongest influences on making sure that we protect buildings so there's no demolition, notably on those soft sites. But this is for conversion, not for demolition. So make sure that we, in any zoning text, we incorporate language like that. As Joe points out, we have a very strong housing plan. We're always fighting for affordability in our units and a range of affordability. So making sure that anything that converts to housing incorporates the formulas that we use for all of our housing that we try to build in this district, so that it has a range of affordability and not just convert to marketplace rents. And really critical, as Dale points out, that I would think in the zoning text, we incorporate language on waste removal, building services, all of that. Like, what is the trash plan buildings when they're converted to residential? I think that if we can incorporate that into the zoning text, it would help protect our streets and sidewalks and make this a better place to live and incentivize people to move here. So it comes full circle that way. So those are my comments. Brian, you raised your hand if you want to add some more. Then JD is his hand up next, and hopefully we can wrap.
Yeah, I just wanted to say people love living here. I think the vacancy rate is low, but I think it's because there's not a lot of housing stock here currently. So I do think the residential vacancy rate, and also
But it should be incorporated. If that's true, Brian, it should be incorporated because that'll strengthen the argument. If it's not true, then we have something else to look at.
Right. And I think one of the other things to note in the area is that a lot of the buildings that were converted to residential, a lot of those were co-ops and condos. I can think of a rental conversion as well, though, on 37th Street. And there's only a few ground up buildings like the Glenwood buildings that are residential. And most of that is concentrated only between 8th and 9th. There's a little bit between 7th and 8th and not much to the east. So I think Paul's point is really good. We should show that, there's not a lot of vacancy here. The thing I wanted to say about some of the bigger buildings that have full lot width at the lower floors and wedding cake back, there are buildings that I could think of that have been successfully converted, with the exception of ground floor retail, to entirely residential on those upper floors. And what they've done on those larger floor plates is those are used as live work spaces. And there should be some component in this where we enable and facilitate live work spaces. The other thing that they've done in a number of those buildings, whether the individual has the full floor, they've divided up some of those floors into a north half and a south half. And so that they're able to not just utilize the upper floors, but the lower floors as well. And that seems to have worked effectively. So there've been a lot of ways to slice the wedding cake, I think, in residential conversions. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity to have both mixed use buildings and full residential buildings. And we just have to make sure for these conversions that we do preserve the ability to have retail on the ground floor, because a lot of our buildings, especially the co-ops, use that to offset or to help pay taxes and building maintenance and stuff like that. So let's just make sure we keep that in the mix. So thank you. That was all I had to say.
Thanks, Brian. JD?
A quick question, Barbara and Frank. Thank you for this presentation. Have you been to Board 5? And if so, what was their response?
I think Board 5 was supportive. They had a lot of the same questions that you had about affordable housing, those kinds of things. But I would say we've been really gratified that we've gotten we've been to Keith Powers, we've been to Eric Botcher, we've been to Board 5. people are very, very supportive of the idea. The devil is in the details, and affordable housing is one of them. So that's what I would say. I mean, Frank, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's right. And everybody has so far supported the concept, and then made and Board 5 made suggestions that I thought were good. And you've just summarized a lot of what board, a lot of good suggestions, and everyone has mentioned the idea of trying to, limit demolitions, get inclusionary or affordable workforce housing of some type, encourage the live workspace idea. So I think we've met with a good response. It's now to be able to communicate it, I guess, well, to them, quite frankly, perhaps to city planning.
Yeah.
They understand all the details.
And the broader public not to get tripped up. That's the most important.
Right. That's the key. That's the key. And to the mayor's office, that there's support for this, because, I think obviously the chair of city planning is in tune to some extent, going to listen to the mayor's office, and they know that the office wants to encourage residential development. That's where the market is. So city planning, though, needs to decide if they can. I think they're feeling under the gun a little bit because they can't hire and they feel understaffed. Is some of their, the feeling I get.
They
are understaffed. They can't hire. It's not a feeling.
Yeah,
So-
that's
They've
right.
said that.
And-
They've
and
said
so-
So I'd like to, I'd like, as I said at the outset, we have committee discussion and then we open up to the public. I'd like to just say to the members of the public watching, if you have any additional comments or questions or concerns, now's your opportunity to raise your hand. And I'm not seeing any go up. So we can probably wrap this up then. So thank you, Barbara and Frank and Sylvia and Anne, for your participation. As you can see, it's a good idea. People seem to want it. And Barbara, as you point out, the devil is in the details. So thank you all. And to the rest of the committee, I would like to propose that we send sort of a letter just to memorialize this conversation. I summarized the three major points that came out of this, that we're generally supportive of this, but we want to make sure there's focus on conversion, not demolition, that we include a range of housing affordability that's in line with our community board housing plan, and that we make sure that our building services are included in any residential components. Would anybody like to add any to that letter? Dale, your hand went up.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the letter should capture the specific recommendations about the presentation. Like, I'd like to see the hotel stock accounted for instance. I think Joe reinforced that, and Joe also had some kind of tactical recommendation. I don't know if we want to, I don't know
Well,
if
I think that what I could,
or just say it, I think it would be good to ask for the presentation to account for hotel stock. It'll just be a clear picture of the district.
Yeah.
I think what I can do is add what Joe had, those 4 points. We should look at, we should include specifics on what's overbuilt, specifics on soft sites, specific on hotels, and incorporate conversion of hotels into residential component.
The other one is for the narrow sites to have regulations for height and bulk and things like that, so we don't get the skinny towers in the middle of the block kind of stuff. Because I think, I think I think city planning might push it not just to conversion, but also to development. You have to be careful. So we just get our stuff out on the table early.
Yeah. And again, I don't know that this certainly won't be the final discussion on this. I think what we're doing here is sort of memorializing our conversation to the Garment District Alliance, so that when they come back to us in 6 months, 9 months, 18 months with the zoning text amendment, that we remember what we said here, and we can hope that that's incorporated into any presentation they make.
But I think we're also signaling to city planning our overall community concerns, so they don't get too far on something that's going to create a problem.
Right. Right. Dolores, there's a new hand.
Sorry, I came late to the discussion, so my apologies. And I agree it's important to memorialize the discussion, but I think to both Dale and Joe's points, it's really important that we at least make sure that we're consistent across all of the things that we advocate for when it comes to land use and housing, and that there's an opportunity in the letter to go ahead and ensure that those bullet points, even if we're not specifically saying that it needs to be applied here, that this is, these are the community concerns, these are the community points that we would like to make sure are part of the conversation for the next round.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, I agree.
And technically, I think since you're co-chair, you can't make the motion, so I'll make the motion for you that we do write the letter that you outlined, including the additional points that Joe and Dale outlined. So that's now an official motion.
Thank you for the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
I see a second from Dale. All in favor? And anybody opposed? Brian, I know you're P&E. Great. Thank you all very much. Dolores, since I also can make another motion, is there another motion you'd like to make tonight?
Oh, a motion to adjourn, but I can't make it. I was late.
I'll accept a motion from anybody.
Okay.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Have a good night. And
Happy
Merry Christmas,
holidays,
happy
everyone.
holidays, everybody.
Yes. Happy holidays.